此时此刻，我们在这个地方，我们各缔约方，我们都希望以人类的智慧、勇气和理智，尽快地找到一条有效的路径，寻求到一个有效的答案，来有力地应对当前生物多样性丧失的危机，尽快地扭转全球生物多样性丧失的局面。那么中国呢，自从作为 COP15 的主席国以来，我们一直在以最大的政治意愿和最强大的推动力来和全球生物多样性治理。习近平总书记在2020年9月第75届联合国大会生物多样性峰会上发表了重要讲话，对中国举办 COP15 大会和全球生物多样性治理表达了坚定的支持和对各位对我们缔约方和各利益关方的热忱欢迎。在去年的昆明的第一阶段会议上，习近平主席和8个国家的领导人以及联合国秘书长古特雷斯在峰会上也发表了主旨讲话，并且呢，也发布了昆明宣言，为 COP15 提供了强大的政治推动力。那么，中国今年6月中国政府经过中国政府、公园秘书处以及加拿大政府我们3方的充分的沟通和协商，我们把 COP15 第2阶段会议通过主席团会议作出决定，我们把 COP15 第2阶段会议转移到蒙特利尔举行。改变会议的会址对中国政府来说是一个艰难的决定，但是呢，也表明中国政府在推动全球生物多样性治理方面坚定的意愿和强大的政治决心。这个地方我想的话呢，作为第2阶段会议，我们继续将作为主席国发挥好领导力和协调力，尽我们最大的努力，推动和协调各方在第2阶段弥合分歧、缩小差距，达成最大的共识，推动形成我们框架的最终的达成。在这里我要特别感谢加拿大政府，感谢他们对第2阶段会议承办的大力支持，感谢公约秘书处和穆雷玛女士的团队，感谢他们务实、卓有成效的工作。我也要感谢主席团的各位成员，感谢各缔约方、各利益攸关方的代表。只有你们，正是在你们的努力和支持下，我们才能够克服重重困难，共同迎来了 COP15 第2阶段会议的历史性的时刻。各位媒体朋友们，我们现在会议的各项议程和各项准备工作已经准备就绪，参会的各方也都表现出推动框架达成强烈的政治意愿。我们在期待，世界也在期待，万事俱备，只欠东风。让我们携起手来，团结一心，共同努力，推动共建地球生命共同体，共建万物和谐的美丽家园。感谢大家。
Thank you very much, Mr. Ronqiu, the COP15 president. It's my pleasure now to introduce His Excellency Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, to deliver remarks to the conference. Minister Guilbeault.
Merci beaucoup, David. Bonjour, bienvenue, good morning. Je suis très fier de vous accueillir dans la ville où j'habite, Montréal, dans la belle province du Québec et bien sûr dans notre beau pays qui est le Canada. Nous aimerions souligner la présence historique des nations Mohawk, Algonquines, Huron-Wendat et Abénaquis dans la grande région de Montréal et sur le territoire de la ville de Montréal où nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui. La protection de la nature et les efforts que nous devons déployer n'ont jamais été aussi importants qu'aujourd'hui. Avec 1 million d'espèces menacées d'extinction dans le monde, la COP15 est le rendez-vous d'une génération. afin de travailler ensemble pour mettre un frein et renverser la perte de biodiversité. Offrir un avenir dans lequel nos sociétés se développeront en harmonie avec la nature, c'est la mission qui nous est confiée. La survie de notre espèce humaine en dépend. Car nous sommes interreliés et interdépendants avec toute vie sur Terre. La crise de la biodiversité à laquelle nous faisons face requiert le même niveau d'effort et d'action que la crise climatique. Et il n'y a pas de temps à perdre. Quand nous conservons et restaurons les forêts et les milieux humides, que nous soutenons la nature, en retour, la nature nous soutient. En séquestrant le carbone, en purifiant notre eau et notre air, nous nous protégeons des désastres et garantissons des écosystèmes riches et vibrants pour assurer toute vie sur Terre. Il s'agit là de quelques-unes des raisons pour lesquelles le Canada a répondu présent pour accueillir la COP15 lorsque les Nations Unies nous en ont fait la demande. Cette conférence ne pouvait plus attendre, le temps presse, nous devons agir sans attendre. We've also stepped up because we know Canada matters and has an important contribution to make. Globally, our country is home to 20% of the world's fresh water, 24% of the wetlands, and 25% of temperate rainforests, as well as 33% of the remaining boreal forest. We're a big country with big ambitions, and our government has been taking big actions. More than $5 billion committed to nature action, with two largest budgetary commitments in Canada's history coming since 2018. We've committed as a country to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. We're working in full partnership with Indigenous peoples as well as provinces and territories. We recognize our privilege and our responsibility as a country. That is why we've committed 20% of our $5.3 billion for international climate finance to support nature-based solutions abroad. It is why we've committed to address harmful subsidies, and we expect to have more to say on international finance as well as Indigenous-led conservation very soon. Through COP15, we will share Canada's nature ambitions with the world. What does that mean? First, let's all commit to halting and reversing the loss of nature. Second, we're seeking a global commitment to conserve at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030, which scientific research shows is the minimum necessary to address the biodiversity and climate crises. Third, we need to mobilize resources to achieve this from governments, private sector, philanthropy, and multilateral institutions. And we must do all this in full partnership with Indigenous peoples. As a host country, Canada is determined to support the Secretariat, the Chinese Presidency, and all countries present here in Montreal for a successful outcome. Les 2 prochaines semaines ne seront pas faciles. Le chemin vers le succès est semé d'embûches et il nous faudra réconcilier des points de vue et des positions parfois très différentes. Néanmoins, que nous le voulions ou non, nous sommes toutes et tous unis par ce lien profond avec la nature dont dépend notre survie sur cette planète. Le Canada est profondément engagé à protéger la richesse de sa biodiversité. Le Canada veut être un partenaire de tous les instants pour qu'ensemble, au terme de ces 2 semaines de collaboration, nous puissions léguer au monde un nouveau cadre mondial ambitieux pour la protection de la biodiversité. Merci à toutes et à tous et très bonne conférence.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. I would like to now invite remarks from Inger Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Inger, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, and distinguished members of the press. Let me start by thanking the People's Republic of China for the leadership and the presidency of this COP, and let me also thank the Government of Canada, the seat of the CBD Secretariat, for their gracious extension to hosting COP 15.2. And in bringing us together, these two, at this crucial moment, a moment in which we need to agree on a plan to secure the very life support system for Earth. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, where we need to agree to make peace with nature. Because we can't afford to continue thrashing a path through the fragile web of nature and biodiversity to clear the way for human development. Species and ecosystems and the benefits that they provide, upon which we all depend, are degrading and dying slowly. And the loss and degradation of biodiversity comes at a cost that we measure not in dollars, but in livelihoods, in hunger, in disease, in vulnerability, in well-being, and yes, in deaths. We did this to ourselves. As the UN Secretary General has said yesterday, we are committing suicide by proxy. But this COP is our chance to start protecting and repairing the web of life. At this meeting, we need to see an ambitious and effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework with clear targets and benchmarks. A framework that faces down the 5 horsemen of the nature apocalypse, defined by IPBES: changing land and sea use, overexploitation of species, climate change, pollution and invasive and non-native species. That deal with the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss, including harmful subsidies, misdirected investments, and unsustainable consumption and production. A deal that delivers for everyone, everywhere: indigenous people, local communities, urban population, those whose livelihoods depend directly on sustainable use of nature. A deal that helps address the wider triple planetary crisis of climate change, of nature and biodiversity loss, and of pollution and waste. A deal that recognizes sovereign and traditional rights and the wider values of biodiversity. A deal that ensures equitable sharing of the benefits from uses of genetic diversity and resources, whether through digital sequencing, information, or otherwise. And so, with agreement on the plan, it'll need to be delivered in full and urgently and across all of society. And that means agreeing here at this COP on sufficient resources and on ensuring greater transparency and progress that must be made in implementation. We have but a few days to act decisively and with principle. And action must be bold, not bracketed, so that we can get this deal done. We got an extra 2 years from the scourge of COVID. Let us not squander that. Rather, let us make sure that we deliver, and deliver for people and for planet. Because once adopted, the global biodiversity framework will serve as a plan to conserve, to sustainably use, and to rebuild the web of life. The negotiations here at this COP must succeed. If the web of life fails, we all fail with it. But if we shore up and make it stronger, it will carry the full weight of humanity for centuries to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. And our final speaker before we start the questions is Elizabeth Maruma Emrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Greetings to you all, and thanks for being here. Let me begin first by thanking our President, Minister Ronchu, for the leadership, guidance throughout this process for preparing for this COP. To Minister Guilbeault for stepping in, the people of Canada, particularly here in Montreal, at short notice. And here we are, splendid venue, where we have the entire, or what it takes to have a peaceful, good place, good venue for you negotiators and other negotiators to give us what has brought us all to this beautiful city of Montreal. We are not here just for just a normal UN Biodiversity Conference. This is a completely different conference, a historic one. It has not happened in the 30 years of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and yet there is still far too much at stake to see happening in the next 2 weeks through that lens of what brought us all here. It has already been underlined that biodiversity underpins our very existence on this planet. It is the food we eat, the water we need, we use, we drink, the clean air we want to breathe, the goods and services, the health in terms of medicines, the climate regulation, And the list goes on. And scientists have all told us, despite all these benefits, yet our own human activities have already altered over 97% of the ecosystems worldwide today. We've been reminded just now, over 1 million species going to extinction within this century. The loss of biodiversity has never reached the rate it is in the history of humankind. Even the recent WWF Living Planet report told us out of the monitored wildlife population, since 1970, 69% have completely dropped. These are not simple numbers. And we know half of the global GDP is dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services it provides. And therefore, the global economy is at risk by the loss of biodiversity by that over 50%. We have the next 2 weeks of 196 parties here in Montreal, parties to the convention, who will be negotiating but have the responsibility to agree and adopt an international policy framework, which we call now post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will provide that roadmap of repairing our human relationship with the natural environment. We have goals for this conference. The goals which include, we need to raise ambition for nature and ensuring a whole of government, a whole of society implementation of the new global plan, which will put nature on a path to recovery by 2030, and humanity on a path to its globally agreed long-term vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050, the time when biodiversity will be well managed, conserved, restored, sustainably used, and ensuring the benefits arising from it are fairly and equitably distributed. We need also to underline the intrinsic link and connection between climate change and biodiversity loss or nature loss. So, meeting the global biodiversity framework goals will equally contribute to the climate agenda, while the full delivery of the Paris Agreement on climate change is needed to ensure the global biodiversity framework also succeeds. We need to ensure that the commitments, or we need to match the commitments with the accountable actions and resources required to implement the framework. We need to engage public, private, philanthropy sectors to close by 2030 the biodiversity finance gap, currently estimated at around $700 billion per year. We need them to align trillions of dollars in global spending with goals for biodiversity and ensure that biodiversity is mainstreamed and considered in economic decisions. It has been mentioned by ministers here. We need to reform, repurpose, redirect harmful subsidies to biodiversity into positive biodiversity activities. So over the next few days, over the last few days, 3 days to yesterday, the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework delegates had worked hard and tirelessly. Some progress has been made, but not so much as needed or expected. And I have personally to admit that I don't feel that the delegates went as far as we had expected. But progress has been made, and that positive aspect is what we need to carry forward. And as they move into now the second part of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, COP15, they need to focus on the end goal, the final result, that is to have an ambitious, realistic, achievable, actionable global biodiversity framework that is easy to communicate, rooted in science, strong enough to put us really on a path to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. The job of the parties now is to ensure that this focus is not lost. They need to refine the text, seek to compromise, and take us on this journey to a future of living in harmony with nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to our panelists for their remarks. We'll now turn to the period of questions. I'll ask the room attendants to prepare some microphones to hand out to the questions that will be asked. I would like to let everybody know we will attempt to have a balance of questions to all the panelists so that we can make sure they've all got an opportunity to express their remarks. So I will first start a question to the COP15 president. I believe I have a colleague in the second row here. Can you pass the microphone to him and you introduce yourself, please?
您好，谢谢。新华社记者，请问作为 COP15 的主席国，中国在推进 COP15 会议进程上开展了哪些工作，取得了哪些成果？第二阶段会议您有哪些期待？谢谢。
好，非常感谢新华社记者的提问。实际上，刚才我在开场致辞中对中国政府在推进 COP15 大会的进程方面所做出的一些工作，已经做了一个概述性的一个介绍。我也想利用这个机会再简单的补充几句。一个呢是在高层政治推动方面，我觉得这是作为主席国高层推动是极其重要的。我一直在强调，中国政府是以最大的政治意愿和最高的行动来推动 COP15 和全球生物多样性治理。我前面谈到2020年和2021年，习近平主席在联合国的生物多样性峰会和第一阶段的领导人峰会上，都发表了重要讲话，就 COP15 以及全球生物多样性治理表明了中国政府的决心。我还想补充2点，一个是上个月在巴厘岛举办的 G20， 也就是20国集团领导人峰会，在会议上做出了一个宣言。这个宣言的话，可能不少的媒体朋友们看到过，其中的话有很大的篇幅是谈到生物多样性治理和加强生物多样性保护的迫切性。这其中的话呢，也包括中国国家主席习近平和其他G20峰会的领导人共同签署了这个宣言，而且呼吁在 COP15 的第二阶段会议上，要通过富有雄心、平衡、务实、有效、强有力且具变革性的2020年后全球生物多样性框架。这些年习近平主席在与欧盟、英、法以及其他国家的一些高层政治对话中也多次提到COP15 和全球生物多样性治理的问题，这是一个方面我补充的。第二个呢，就这一年多来中国政府在第一阶段会议以后，在发挥领导力、协调各方、减小分歧、缩小差距、形成共识方面，我们也和秘书处一起做了大量工作。这其中也包括我们利用今年7月在纽约召开的联合国可持续发展高级别政治论坛，以及在巴厘岛召开的 G20 环境与气候环境部长会议等这样一些重要的国际场合包括 COP27，刚刚结束的 COP27， 我们都充分利用这样一些场合的话呢，来进行沟通和协商，保持推动 COP15 的政治势头，同时也尽量的去沟通各缔约方和利益相关方，达成更多的共识。另外这1年多我们和秘书处一起还主持召开了近40次的主席团会议。这个在一般的环境公约里面这也不多的，我们开了40次会，这一年多的时间里面， 另外的话，我们还开了100多次各个层级的，包括研讨会、双边会、多边会、圆桌会这样一些个会议的话呢，来建立沟通和交流，为各个缔约方啊提供这样一些个支撑。所以我想，这个是我们在发挥领导力方面啊所做的一些具体推动。最后我再补充一点的话呢，就是在发挥社会组织和企业的这个推动作用方面啊，我们2018年在 COP14 上，COP14上，埃及政府、中国政府和秘书处我们一起啊，发起了从沙姆沙耶赫到昆明这么一个行动倡议。那么根据我们统计啊，这个行动倡议里面涉及到社会组织和企业行为的承诺和行动，10%是中国的企业家和中国的社会组织所做出的努力。另外的话呢，我们的社会组织、我们的企业家的话呢，还承诺在近10年时间里面提供25亿的资金，推动10万平方公里的土地的生态修复和环境治理。我想这些都是中国的社会组织啊和企业他们所做出的具体贡献。你问到的对下一阶段会议的就第2阶段会议的期待啊，我想一句话，我是期待各缔约方啊和利益攸关方在我们第2阶段会议的磋商。刚才穆里玛女士也谈到了，我们第2阶段会议的话，主要是聚焦框架的谈判和磋商。我希望的话呢，各缔约方、各利益攸关方啊，能够拿出最大的诚意，展示最大的灵活性，来寻求最大的公约数，来推动我们框架的达成。谢谢。
Thank you very much, Minister. So I do want to note that we have people at the microphones. I will note that we wish to have a balance of questions. So for the first microphone, I would ask if you have a question to be directed to another one of the panelists and not the COP15 president. Is that the case?
Oui.
OK, allez-y, posez votre question.
Donc, bonjour, Éric Pierre-Champagne du quotidien La Presse à Montréal. En fait, ma question est pour M. Guilbeault. Cette COP-ci est un peu particulière parce que c'est le Canada est l'hôte de la COP qui est présidée par la Chine. Alors, comment vous voyez votre rôle dans ce contexte-là? Bon, connaissant l'importance, on l'a vu dans les COP sur le climat, l'importance de la présidence, souvent dans les derniers jours là, de la COP, là, la présidence peut jouer un rôle assez significatif. Donc, comment vous voyez votre rôle dans ce contexte-là? Puis avez-vous des discussions justement avec votre homologue chinois sur la participation du Canada dans ce sens-là?
Merci pour la question. Bien entendu, lorsque les Nations Unies, au printemps dernier, nous ont approchés pour être l'hôte de la conférence, c'était dans le cadre d'une discussion qui avait eu lieu au sein de ce qu'on appelle le bureau, donc l'équivalent du conseil d'administration de la Convention, avec la participation de la Chine. Donc, c'est une décision conjointe de tenir cette conférence-ci à Montréal, au Canada, et que le Canada soit le pays hôte. Comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, nous entendons jouer un rôle très proactif comme pays hôte, en support au secrétariat à la présidence chinoise ainsi qu'à tous les pays qui sont ici pour qu'il y ait un succès au sortir de la conférence. Vous le savez, le Canada fait partie, est un membre actif de la coalition pour la haute ambition. Nous sommes maintenant, j'ai regardé la semaine dernière, là, il y a plus de 120 pays qui font partie de cette coalition-là. Alors, je pense qu'il y a, comme le disait à la fois le ministre Ronku, Mme Mrema et Mme Anderson, il y a vraiment un momentum important et le Canada veut continuer et contribuer à bâtir sur ce momentum-là.
Merci.
Thank you very, very much. So I note that we have other questions on the floor for others. I recognize Patrick Greenfield from The Guardian. Hopefully your question is to one of the other panelists who hasn't spoken yet. Can we get a microphone to Patrick Greenfield here? Second side here, third row. Thank you very much. It's okay, Patrick, there's one coming to you. He has two now. It's an embarrassment of riches.
Executive Secretary, it's fantastic to finally be here at COP15. I wanted to ask about the overlap with climate that you've talked about so much. Is it also the case that over the next 2 weeks, 1.5 degrees is on the line?
Thank you very much. I will say a few words and hope you will permit also Inga to contribute on that. One, we need to underline the direct connection now between climate change and biodiversity. And one of the draft targets in the framework is on contributing to climate change. But it's not just that one target which mentions climate change. Virtually, the success of the framework, all of the targets will have an impact on climate change. If we look at the recent disasters, be it floods, drought, heat waves, wildfires, yes, we always say it's because of climate change, but where are these disasters happening? They all happen on the ecosystem, on biodiversity. And clearly, unless we protect and restore that biodiversity, climate warming will continue to rise, and we might fail to reach the 1.5 degrees. Not surprising that scientists have told us 30% of climate mitigation is expected to come from biodiversity conservation. And climate community looking at nature, biodiversity, based solutions to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And therefore, that discussion is on the table. Thank you. But Inga?
Maybe just to add, I mean, it's obvious that that mangrove, that coastal forest, that estuary, that coral reef will break the waves, will protect the people, will ensure that the very lungs of nature can absorb the pressure that nature puts at us. So on the adaptation side, it's self-evident. And of course, on the mitigation side is also self-evident. The more biomass we have, the more carbon we store, and that's a good thing for people and for the planet. There is, and IPBES has made this very clear in identifying these 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, a dimension directly contributed by climate change to species loss, right? I always have to take a run at this word, but the phenology of the mismatches as some species migrate based on heat and other hatch based on light, etc., and humidity. So those mismatches are, of course, more and more apparent the more we are seeing climatic variability. I think the Secretary General has stressed again and again the indivisibility of the Rio Conventions, including, therefore, also the Desertification Convention that deals with land, productivity, etc. And that becomes very clear. And having just come here from Uruguay, where we are engaging in the talks around plastics, we need to understand that pollution is also a driver of biodiversity loss. So the whole system is interconnected, and I think that that's very much on the mind of negotiators here, which is why the targets are as encompassing as they are, because to recognize this without duplicating in other conventions and agreements.
David, can I briefly? Thank you. One might argue, and I guess I am, that our 1.5 is 30 by 30, is protecting 30% of lands and oceans by 2030, is the biodiversity equivalent of the 1.5 degrees on climate change. And I think that's one of our collective goals. I wish, and Canada wishes, for this to be one of our collective goals, as does the High Ambition Coalition for this conference. Thank you.
Excellent. So just a minute here, Solon. Etienne, is your question to, which panelist is your question to? I've got to get a balance here.
Ministre Guilbeault.
Certainement. Allez-y.
Monsieur Guilbeault, donc vous venez de dire justement que le Canada, en tant que pays hôte, est un pays qui doit donner l'exemple. Vous dites, pour nous, le 1,5, c'est de protéger 30% du territoire marin et terrestre. Est-ce que vous vous engagez à protéger des territoires qui sont susceptibles d'être développés et pas seulement des territoires dans le Grand Nord qui n'ont pas vraiment d'impact sur le développement, des territoires à risque dans le sud du pays?
Bien sûr que oui.
Donc, c'est votre engagement? Parce que ce qui s'est fait dans le passé, c'est surtout des territoires qui étaient très peu convoités, très peu à risque de développement. Je
pourrais vous donner l'exemple de notre engagement de créer 15 nouveaux parcs urbains à travers parcs urbains nationaux à travers le pays. Évidemment, des forêts intactes vierges près du centre-ville de Montréal, Toronto, Vancouver ou Halifax, il n'en reste plus beaucoup. Alors, il y a quand même des endroits à protéger intéressants, mais dans ce contexte-là, on sera peut-être plus dans la restauration de milieux qui ont été dégradés ou de milieux qui ont été dégradés que dans la protection de milieux intacts. Mais je pense que d'un point de vue de la biodiversité, ça a aussi une valeur importante. Alors, je pense qu'on doit faire les deux, mais absolument, on va protéger évidemment, tant au nord qu'au sud des territoires dans le cadre de l'atteinte de notre objectif de 30 par 30. C'est un objectif qui est quantitatif, mais je pense que votre question porte sur l'aspect qualitatif de ça aussi, et c'est évidemment un critère d'analyse pour la sélection des projets pour le gouvernement fédéral.
Great, thank you very much. I will now take a question from the third row on this side here, the gentleman in the suit. Let's see here, who's your question directed towards?
My question directed to the Secretary Murama.
Okay, very good, thank you. And introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm a reporter from the paper, China, and my question to Mrs. Secretary is, you just mentioned this is a historical conference, and we know that the main agenda for this conference is to achieve the post-2020 framework. So for those who are not very familiar with this framework, can you introduce us the significant meaning of this framework and why it is so important? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, we need to understand that under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the program of work is based on a 10-year plan. So we've finished what we are calling Biodiversity Strategic Plan with 20 IH biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, at global level, none of the 20 IH biodiversity targets were met or achieved. But we also know that good progress, some progress was made at national level in a number of countries. And when I say these targets were not met, that came also at the time, and especially through the IPBS report or Global Biodiversity Outlook Report 5, which shows us that not only that we have not achieved those targets globally, but the state of the planet is in a serious crisis. Crisis under climate change, crisis of pollution, crisis of the loss of biodiversity. And the scientists have underlined to us, this is our last chance to act. Otherwise, all of us will perish. And unfortunately, we have no planet B to go to, or there's no other planet to live with our future generation or the children. So that's the backdrop of why we are here. So if this is our last chance, this is the time to take action. This is what then is underlined under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework now, which is presented with a long-term vision, 2050, when the world will live in harmony with nature, with 4 goals, which basically 4 goals which will lead us to 2030, with currently about 22 draft targets, which provide that pathway to enable the world to reach, first to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And that will require actions to take place at all levels of the society, and that's why I mentioned we need whole of government. It's not the matter to be left to the ministries of environment alone, and this is one of the lessons we've learned from the failure of the IH biodiversity targets. Biodiversity, nature, environment is a cross-cutting issue. So we need everybody, and the framework will be framework for all. No one should be left behind. It's when I say framework for all, also taking into account the interests of stakeholders, indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth, the women. But also we are seeing the business, the financial institutions also on board. And all these different stakeholders can see themselves in the draft framework because they have specific actions to take to contribute to that effectiveness of the framework. What will be important after the framework is adopted is implementation. Yes, we can have a framework on paper, but that will be a useless paper unless it is turned into action on the ground. Action on the ground which now will actually change the relationship, our human actions on nature, which have been the worst culprit, if I may use that word. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. I'll take a question from the microphone in the front. The woman in the blue shirt, please.
Hi, Elisa, Radio Canada. My question is for the Executive Secretary. You've mentioned that we need to see some compromise. This text needs to be refined. What kind of compromise would be acceptable in order to make that COP15 a success?
First, we need compromise on all targets, because unless all targets are implemented, we may not reach those the 2030 halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity. So one is to avoid the pick and choose, because they are all connected, they are all related. In terms of compromise also, the current draft still has a lot of brackets. So we need the negotiators to discuss and agree to remove those brackets. We know when you have over 190 countries sitting and negotiating, it's not easy to agree on a word which is common to all the countries. And this is where the give and take comes in. Flexibility, compromise, consensus. It doesn't mean at the end of the day, each country will get 100, 200% of what they would have wished to get, but at least agree to move with the consensus and be ready to contribute to the implementation without blocking that agreement or that compromise.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I think,
Inga
sorry,
would like to add then?
certainly, Ingrid, go ahead.
If I may just add, I mean, this is sort of a message beyond the press conference, but it's absolutely critical that all negotiators and all negotiating leads realize that it's down to the wire now, and it's time to come under the big tent. Corner solutions, they start early on in a negotiating process. It's normal, and we respect that. But we have a presidency that is determined to drive us to the end goal, and it's now time for everyone to move a little. And that moving a little becomes critical right now. Words that are being bandied about are actually very much similar. Let's just settle on some of these things. Because when the gavel goes down and the day is done, what will be remembered is not the complexity around a word. What will be remembered is the level of ambition and the implementation that followed. And that is what we need to aim for. And therefore, I ask that all negotiators now take courage. The heads of state have spoken. We heard that from His Excellency, the Minister, and in G20, in the General Assembly. They want this. Ministers have spoken very clearly. The two ministers actually hosted an informal ministerial on the sidelines of COP27. So it is time now to meet in the middle. And whilst we've been given 2 extra years for these negotiations, that was not a gift we wanted because of COVID, of course, we must not assume that this is now unending. It is ending, and it can entirely be done. We've seen it again and again in multilateral negotiations, so we very much encourage everyone to listen to the wise words from the Executive Secretary so that we can get this done.
Thank you very much. To continue this conversation, my apologies, I was texted a question from the China Daily for the COP15 president that follows exactly this line. So our colleagues from the China Daily who sent me this message? Okay, I'll read out the question because, Mr. Minister, I believe it fits this. The question is, what are the difficulties and challenges in the current negotiations? And more importantly, how will you exert your leadership to promote all parties to bridge differences, form concerted efforts, and push to reach the agreement of the post-2020 biodiversity conservation framework? To the President.
感谢这位记者朋友的提问。你这个问题是一个非常复杂的问题。实际上，刚才威廉玛女士和安德森女士的话，也从一个侧面的话，讲到了谈判达成框架的艰难性。当然了，我想的话呢，对于这样一个带有历史性、标志性的框架来说，有困难和有挑战，这是正常的，这是正常的。何况我们还有196个缔约方，每个缔约方的话都希望把他们最关切的东西表达出来，所以在这个时候谈判很艰难，我们会遇到困难和挑战。至于说你刚才是问到哪些困难和挑战，我想在我的印象里面的话，主要还是那么几个方面。第一个的话，实际上刚才威廉玛女士前面已经谈到了，也就是框架怎么样实现好我们公约的3大目标。公约强调的话呢，保护、可持续利用和会议分享3大目标。那么，怎么样寻求3者的平衡，使我们最后形成的框架文件既具有雄心，同时又务实平衡？我想，这个是对我们来说是一个很大的挑战。我们不能激轻激重，所以我想这是第一个问题。第二个问题的话呢，这也是普遍的问题。你要实现我们框架的20几个目标，那必须得有足够的资源和资金。从量来说，我们现在还是一个缺口，缺口很大，生物多样性的治理资金。另外的话呢，从机制来看，怎么样构建一个机制，合理的机制，来满足发展中国家的需要，这也是一个突出的问题。第三呢，我想就是一个比较技术性比较强的，就是关于 DSI 的问题。DSI 的问题，虽然的话呢，目前 DSI 的进展和1年前相比还是比较大的，也可以说是很大的，但是的话呢，在诸多的技术和政策方面的话，还有很多的问题需要解决。当然，框架谈判还有别的问题，你比如说执行情况的审查机制，你比如说监测和评估的框架等等。那么，我想下一步的话还要开展大量的工作。作为主席啊，我想这些困难和挑战我都可以理解。各方谈判的话，也都付出了非常艰辛的努力。这个之前3号到5号我们开了第5次工作组的会议。据我了解啊，我们代表们啊，每天啊，我们叫熬更守夜啊，每天半夜才结束磋商，回到宾馆休息。这个代表们也都非常的敬业，非常的投入。但是呢，中国有句古话叫做磨刀不误砍柴工啊。我们今天付出的这些努力，实际上都会为我们接下来的这个 COP15 的第2个阶段的正式会议的磋商奠定很好的基础。我相信这是值的，这是值的。那么至于说下一步的话，怎么样推动这样一些问题的解决，我想的话呢，除了会议秘书处在主席团我们多次讨论的基础上制定的这个会议的正常的日程安排，包括我们2个工作组、14个接触组的这么一个谈判框架下，这个会议机制下推动议题磋商以外，我想还可以利用这么几个机会啊，来进一步的加强对重点议题的磋商。你比如说，我们中间的话还有个高级别会议，所以怎么样充分利用好高级别会议这次机会啊，依靠政治家的勇气和胆识，来最后达成我们关键议题上的分歧。政治家在这方面的话呢，和我们具体的基础工作层面，还是有更高的站位来推动这样一个共识的形成。所以我想这是一个机会。我们在15号到17号还要召开高级别会议，我们还有一些难点议题或者是很难形成一致的议题，还可以利用这个机会的话呢，进一步的话来推动。第2个的话呢，我们还可以利用一些务实有效的一些小范围的会议机制，范围小但是成绩高、形式灵活这样一些机制，比如主席之友啊，高级别会议这个部长级的协调啊，这样一些机制的话呢，来推动共识的达成。第3的话呢， 我想在这个过程中啊，我们还要充分的确保各利益攸关方的广泛参与，包括社会公众、NGO、私营部门、青年团体、土著居民，广泛听取他们的意见，来助力框架的达成。最后的话呢，我们也可以对在我们整个会议的进程过程中，我们会有一个机制，就是我们会不断的去研判，不断去盘点，会议进行过程中还有哪些问题的话，需要我们对会议的进程做出调整和优化的，我们还可以实时做出调整和优化。我想从我这个角度啊，我还想从这些角度的话呢，来推动我们谈判进程，力争能够最终达成我们的框架。谢谢。
Thank you very much. I'll take a question from the second microphone in the back. This will unfortunately be our last question because the ministers and panelists have bilaterals after this. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Jayla Bernstein for CBC. My question is for Minister Guilbeault. I'm just wondering if you can speak, well, you mentioned that your hope is to share Canada's ambition for preserving biodiversity with the world. And I'm just wondering if you can square that hope to be a leader on the world stage with the fact that Canada has failed to meet previous biodiversity targets. And in fact, your Auditor General's office has said we're not on track to meet our goals for 2025 or 2030. So I'm just hoping you can speak to how you plan to square past failures with your plan to be a leader and a plan to get an agreement sealed by the end of the next 2 weeks.
I think we didn't achieve our targets before because we didn't give ourselves the means to do it. And frankly, what is true of Canada is true of what we're seeing internationally. And I think we in Canada and many of us here are working really hard to change this, both domestically and internationally. There were reports, recent reports by the Canadian CPAWS, the Canadian Wilderness Society, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and I believe, was it Nature Canada or the Nature Conservancy, that shows how Canada can meet our 2025 and 2030 conservation goals. When we came into power in 2015, Canada wasn't even protecting 2% of its oceans and coastline. We're at 15% now. We did that in 7 years. So basically, in the next 7 years, we have to redo what we did over the past 7 years. I spoke about the record level investment we're making. Are certainly part of the solution. It's not just about money, but it is certainly in part about money. It's about the nature agreement we're developing with provinces and territories, where I'm hoping that in the coming days we will be able to announce real progress on this. So it's not just the federal government, but us working with provinces and territories in ways we've never done before, and obviously with Indigenous people as well. So I think we are trying to give ourselves the means to do this domestically, and this meeting is about giving ourselves collectively, internationally, the means to do it as well on the international scene.
Good, thank you very much. Our panelists have bilaterals, including with ministers and the Secretary General, so thank you to all our panelists for the press conference, and thank you to the journalists for joining us. So our panelists will file and will leave the green room. Journalists, you'll have another meeting, another press conference with WWF at 11 a.m. this morning. Thank you so much for our panelists. Thank you.